All right, here we are, PCology 230. This is chapter 23. Still talking about resistance training for clients who are athletes. And this will give a kind of a topical overview. We're not going to dig in super deep here. There are some things you'll need to recall for later. But this is a compare and contrast of just some basics of traditional and undulating models of periodization program design. And we're now on page 624 in our book. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So with traditional periodization, the book notes this, it's often mistermed as linear periodization, and it's this kind of gradual increase in training intensity with reductions in training volume. And a graphical interpretation is very much the classical as one of the variables, that being load, increases, the ability to perform that load decreases, meaning the volume decreases. And it makes sense, right? If we're talking about doing 90% of a 1 rep max, you can't do 90% as many times as you would do 70% of a 1 rep max. So one can just graphically interpret that in your head pretty easily. But what you see is with the manipulation of this from mesocycle to mesocycle is you start to now put together how you can have volume and loading parameters that can be on average within one range or one bucket for one mesocycle, or even a microcycle if we're talking week to week. And then when you get into the next loading bucket, if you will, or training program design or mesocycle, you then have different rep and set schemes with different average intensity parameters for your program design. But in general, it's this, and you got to think of it this way. You can't really go from or take your athletes or your clients from high volume sets of 12 to 15 down to sets of 1 in 2 weeks or 3 weeks time. I mean, you sure could, but you're probably going to wreck them, and you're not going to get the performance out of them that you want in terms of an increase in maximal or ability to press maximal weight. So what you have to do is have gradual reductions in volume over time and then gradual increases of intensity over time to be able to push your clients, or more accurately, apply the right training stimulus to get the training response you want. Now, if you're training a bunch of distance runners, then sets of 15 to sets of 20 is kind of where you're going to live. But if you're training a bunch of power athletes, then you may have to go from that hypertrophy to base strength to strength to power and change the rep and set schemes over time to drive your athletes towards a 1 rep max test out or a 3 rep max test out. Very common. So the book notes that before starting the periodized program or periodization program, the trainer should recommend that the athlete compete in lower intensity 4 to 6 week base training program, to which I agree. The introductory program will allow the athlete to learn the exercise technique, gain an initial adaptation to resistance exercise stress, and prepare for the first training cycle, to which I agree. Loads are typically very light, and they're somewhere between 15 and 20 reps, to which I go, maybe, because it depends upon the sport, it depends upon the position, depends upon the goal, depends upon which mesocycle we're talking about going into what part of the competitive season. So there's a couple other variables here that they really don't shine a light on from a program design standpoint. And I would urge you, as you get deeper into this, maybe suss those out. But I would tell you, if you have somebody who is a power athlete or participating in a power sport, you might not be taking them to the 15 to 20 repetition range. You might be a little bit further down. Perhaps you're in the tens to start off with them. And then what you can do is play around with your total volume load. Instead of doing sets of 10 at 70%, like I presented in a different presentation, maybe do your sets of 10 at 60% or 55%. And we talked a little bit about the neurological components of the myoneural interaction that you have within the motor unit itself. So you're working on the neural side, but you're kind of giving the myo side a little break when you drop the loading parameters. So my point to you is this. This one's highlighted, it's in yellow. Remember it as it is, but I'll tell you, as somebody who has coached, it depends. When you get to this last sentence down here, loads are typically very light, agree, but you're at 15 to 20 reps. I would say it depends, and it depends on the sport, it depends on a number of other variables. Okay, so with this, you have a table. There's a couple tables that they provide you, but this is one of them. And if you remember that pyramid we had, and we talked about hypertrophy, strength, power, competition, active rest. When you look at this table, what you have is a 2 to 3 week mesocycle, a 2 to 3 week mesocycle, 2 to 3, 2 to 3. So really you have 2, 4, 6, 8, or 3, 6, 9, 12, somewhere between an 8 to 12 week program with 1 week of active rest. What they're proposing here is that you would do anywhere between 3 to 5, 3 to 5, 3 to 5, and then in competition you might have 1 to 4. And I would say that kind of depends upon the person, but we're just going to go with this model for right now in terms of a traditional periodization program. The hypertrophy phase, they list anywhere between 6 and 30 reps. I think that's a really broad range to work in when you start talking about working with athletes. And if we're talking about power athletes, there's probably no way you're going to take them to 30. Perhaps you're going to be in a lower repetition range, like I mentioned before, but you're going to be at a lower intensity. So we continually prime the central nervous system to work within the repetition range that's desired for the particular activity. But you can use these, just a sidebar, you can use these higher volumes every once in a while with a power-oriented athlete just to kind of, and I hate to use a real non-professional way to say this, just blow them right out of the water. You know, just kind of like have a completely different stimulus applied to the human organism so their body has to adapt to something completely different as a mechanism to elicit a reset, if you will, training response to go back into your 3 to 5 sets to 1 to 6 reps. I've done that. I've done that with athletes, and it does shock the system. They talk about the rest period here, about greater than 2 minutes. Less than 2 minutes. Excuse me. And what you have is, when you look at this, and I'm sorry, I said greater than and less than, I'm saying two things both ways. Let me just clarify. They're saying rest period greater than 2 minutes. Holy smokes, Adrian, get it out. And they're talking about 60 to 90 seconds for singles run exercises, 2 to 5 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes, and 3 to 5. So, you know, you think of this in terms of having to replenish ATP. And when we're talking about competition or even in the strength power side of the equation, you know, we want the replenishment of ATP. And you'll see power lifters and Olympic weightlifters take a sizable amount of time in between their work sets to allow for the recovery so they can then have yet again another maximal attempt. This is with the caveat that you got to understand that when you're talking about high strength activities or high power oriented activities, you almost have to run lockstep with those two things and say the other part of this is there is also a very high technical component to these as well. And fatigue erodes the ability to adhere to a high technical component. So you have to be able to allow the rest, not only for the replenishment of ATP and to be able to push out maximal effort on each rep in a lower rep range, but also you're allowing the person to recover fully to have a better or safer maximal attempt. Within the assigned load category here, we're talking less than 85. That's probably where I said less than before. I probably saw that and just intuitively said that. We have less than 85% there. And then you're looking at 85% of 1 rep max, and you have 80 to 100% of a 6 to a 30 rep max, which I read that and I kind of go, how? Right? How are you going to have a 30 RM at 80%? You're just not. It's unrealistic, but I digress. So when we get down here to assigned loads, when we talk strength, now you're greater than 85%. And that's 85% of 1 rep max, and you're at 80 to 100% of a 1 to 6, somewhere in that range. And again, I think that you have to kind of do the math on some of these with some of these numbers in terms of the rep range and ask, is 80% appropriate for a 6 rep attempt? I can tell you for dang sure that 80% is not appropriate for 30 rep. But my point is just make sure you take a little time and kind of acquaint yourself with this chart. Now let's go ahead and go into this. This is now an undulating periodization program. And I know there's a question specific to this on the quiz, and I'm blanking out on exactly what it is, but it's specific to, like, in the light phase, you need to do less than 75% of 1 rep max, or it's something along those lines. So where I'm going with this is I would urge you to take a moment to kind of refresh on this. I'll talk it through, but make sure you have this kind of committed to memory or even have it up on your screen as you're going through some of the questions on the quiz and the exam, because I know there's some questions specific to this as well as the other table. And this is table number 23-7, by the way. So in the heavy phase, just notice what's going on here. In a heavy phase, light phase, power phase, the number of sets changes, and if you compare and contrast these, your heavy and power sets, heavy and power oriented exercises have 3 to 4 sets. Your light and moderate are 2 to 4 sets. You have goal repetitions, 3 to 6 for heavy, 1 to 6 for power, which makes sense. And I know I talked a little bit about this in terms of when you get into power-oriented activities. And that was that one pager where I brought out kind of the rep and set combinations, and I did 0.03 per rep. When you get into the power-oriented exercises, the rep ranges do kind of skew downward a little bit. Like you wouldn't do the higher rep ranges for power-oriented stuff. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it in terms of the amount of work that's being done when we incorporate power into the equation. So in terms of kind of like putting this on a continuum, you would have for a light day, that'd be very much like what we just saw for hypertrophy, up to 30 reps. And then you have moderate, which is kind of like your base strength. Then you get into heavy, which is kind of like strength. And then you have power, which is 1 to 6. So you can kind of juxtaposition these two side by side to kind of compare and contrast each of these. And then when you look at the rest period length, it's pretty darn close. There are some similarities, but there's some variations. So you can maybe put these up side by side on your screen and just have some compare and contrast so you know what you're getting yourself into. And then the loading parameters themselves are a little bit different. So if you look at the percentages that you see, and now with these, when we're talking about power, this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? When we get into power-oriented exercises, and when you're talking about power-oriented exercises that have a high technical component to them, you have to take into account that the rep ranges might be a little bit lower because you want enough load to be able to have, how can I say this, to be able to have the body learn the correct movement pattern to move under load, but not so heavy that there's constant failed attempts where you're trying to learn how to do the correct movement pattern. It's basically a very wordy way of saying it is appropriate weight to have the appropriate technique for the appropriate lift. So again, I would commit myself to maybe memorize a few of these or have an understanding of these because I know there's a little bit of compare and contrast with these. Now this looks like a lot going on. Now, just so you can kind of wrap yourself around it, I'll present it, you can freeze it, and you can kind of start to wrap your brain around what's going on here. But this is an undulating periodization program. These are the number of weeks on a side, 1 through 15, with active rest at week 16. You look at this, you have 3 sets of 6, 3 sets of 6, 4 sets of 6, 3 sets of 5, 3 sets of 5, 4 sets of 5. And it gives you an idea of the actual total volume that's happening here. 3 by 6 is 18. That's on a heavy day. And if we go to a light day, it now goes to 3 sets of 15. A moderate day, 3 sets of 10. So you can start to do the math in terms of what the actual volume is. Well, 6 times 3 is 18. This is 45. This is going to be 12, and this one's going to be 30. So you start to kind of wrap yourself around the nomenclature and the verbiage that the NSCA has, where a heavy day is perhaps in this particular rep range for total volume for the day, whereas on a light day, the total volume is different. And then you look at this and go, okay, so if I'm doing 3 sets of 6, I'm doing 18 reps. I'm going to rest for 4 minutes, but I'm going to be at 85-ish of a 1 rep max or 90% at a 6 RM. And you kind of look at this, you're at 65 to 80. Over here, you're at 30 to 50. Over here, we go a little bit further. When you go into a moderate day, you're at 75 to 80. So with this, what you see also mapped out here, and I just want to point this out, is on the power day, you see how you have load for power and then load for other exercises. Notice how they're different, and that's with purpose, and that's what I was talking about before. So with power exercises, a personal trainer should assign loads 30% to 70% of the 1 rep max to allow the athlete to perform them explosively, and I would say to allow them to perform the exercises explosively yet properly. So, take a little bit of time to commit this to memory as well. I don't think you have to have this be like copious notes for this, but you at least have an understanding of how you have a heavy day, a light day, a power day, and a moderate day. And that you can map that out maybe on a Monday, a Tuesday, a Thursday, and a Friday in your workouts. All right, guys, I'm breaking off. I only got 15 minutes and I'm on the countdown here. So I'm going to go ahead and see you on the next presentation.